Jack Schneider. Thanks for accepting my invitation to be on my podcast.
Great to be here.
Thanks. I've been looking forward to this. I really have. And I know we've had kind of conversations in the past, and I've really appreciated that. But I really wanted to get you on today to talk to you about some of your work. But for those listeners who don't know you, and they might be tuning in for the first time, can you maybe provide a bit of a background about yourself, where you currently work and what you do and so on and so forth?
Sure. I am the Dwight W. Allen Distinguished Professor of Education Policy and something else. It's too many words, at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, where I direct the Center for Education Policy. And I teach courses in education reform and organizational improvement. I also teach some very large undergraduate courses to some bright-eyed novices. And I have been to Australia several times on trips that were at least billed as research trips, but which also included plenty of surfing, since I grew up in Los Angeles surfing, and I'm currently recovering from labrum surgery. And I will be honest and say that the most helpful tips that I've found have been on Reddit threads where Aussies have been talking about listening to their physios, as I believe you all call your physical therapists. So I'm spending a lot of time in physical therapy these days so I can eventually get back in the water.
Yeah, I always talk about California, and there are parts of Australia, like sometimes when I'm in California, I swear sometimes I'm in Australia. They're so similar.
Yeah.
It's
Absolutely.
Unbelievable how similar they are. Yeah. Like, the geography, the landscape, even the colors. Yep. Yeah. Sorry, you got me on a bit of a tangent there.
Yeah, I grew up in California believing that that eucalyptus trees were indigenous to California because they're so abundant. They're such a natural part of the environment. But of course, we got them from you.
Yeah. And I tell you what, they grow like a weed too, I should point out. All right, so my first question really goes to, so you lead the Beyond the Test Scores project, and you've argued that, current measures of school quality, are pretty much fundamentally inadequate. Now, so the obvious question then to ask is, what do people actually value in schools, that standardized tests fail to capture? And then a bit of an extension type question on that one is, how can we measure what matters without creating new forms of harmful accountability? So it's kind of a two-parter, really. But
sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, I have a lot of fun with people around the first part of that question, just asking them to think through what they want schools to do, because I think the question that you're asking of me is one that we can ask of ourselves. And the fact is that mostly we don't ask it. It's a weird phenomenon that, in countries like Australia and the United States, we send our kids to school for more than a decade, for, roughly 175 days each year. That's a lot of days that they spend in school. And we spend almost 0 days talking about why we're doing this and what we want them to get out of it and what we hope to get out of it, either as parents or as citizens and taxpayers. That results in a lot of deferring our authority to leaders in government or to the free market. And so I think what ends up kind of eating every other aim is the social mobility aim, is the use of school to get ahead in the world. But if you actually ask people, sit down and think about it, what do you want your kids to get out of school? What do you want every kid to get out of school? People tend to talk about the same basket of goods that you could name and develop into, 2 dozen, 3 dozen different constructs. So people talk about things like, yes, I want my kid to learn math and to, become a reader and a writer and to understand science and history, et cetera. But I also want my kid to be exposed to arts and to music education. I want my child to have an understanding of, physical health and to be physically active. I want my child to feel a sense of belonging and a sense of community. I want my child, and in fact, all children, to be able to get along across difference, to understand what it means to be a citizen, to know how to contribute to society, to think creatively, to understand what they're individually good at and what they care about, right? We can eventually go on, right? Once the steam engine gets moving. But when you first ask people, they tend to get paralyzed because they don't have a set answer at the ready. And so a lot of my work is about just trying to populate our conversation with these many aims that mostly go unarticulated. And I think that the answer to what we do in our schools should come from all of us. It shouldn't be that we don't discuss this and we just defer to whoever happens to be in power, to whatever regime happens to be framing the purpose and meaning of school. So in the United States, for the past couple decades, the rhetoric has really tilted towards career readiness, national strength, as if the only reason that we have public education in this country and spend the better part of $1 trillion each year on it would be to, feed our economy. That's certainly not why most of us are sending our kids to school every day. And it certainly isn't the only reason why we support public education. To your second point, or second question, or second part of the question there, I think it's an equally important question to ask, right? If we're going to begin assessing all of the domains of school quality, how can we do so without actually making the over assessing of students and the nightmare of neoliberal accountability even worse than it already is? And, we could get into this further if you want. I'm happy to, but I think there are a couple basics here. One is, I don't think we need algorithmic accountability. I think if you remove automatic kinds of punishments for schools, if you remove the kinds of sticks that we have here in the United States, and you simply provide information to people, I think that goes a long way to disarming accountability systems, from de-weaponizing them, in some ways quite literally. I think another is to design these systems knowing that people are still going to be receiving a lot of messages about the importance of their children getting ahead of other children in a free market and competing for credentials that they can trade in for access to opportunity. And so anything we do needs to bear that in mind. If all we're doing is arming well-to-do families with information that they can use to just keep their kids one step ahead of everybody else, I don't think that's a particularly effective use of information about school quality. And then third is we just need to remember that anything that we're doing to assess schools and school quality and student learning is going to come at the expense of time. And we need to minimize the amount of time that we're taking to essentially check the temperature of the patient, so that the patient can carry on with their life. So in some of our work, we do surveying, and it would be great. I would love to survey students and teachers every single day. But that would be 30 to 45 minutes every single day that would be lost to instruction or to students learning how to play the cello or to chess club or whatever it is that is happening during the school day. And so a third rule there is just remembering that measurement can't trump the ultimate aim of making school meaningful and valuable while young people are there.
So it's interesting. There's a lot there to kind of unpack, and I want to just ask a follow-up question around that. So, there's a big question mark that you can even measure some of those non-instrumental things that you talked about. You mentioned a whole range of things that it could be argued that they could be extremely difficult to measure, even if you wanted to. Like, so let's say hypothetically, you even wanted to measure, say, let's just call them soft skills for the sake of this conversation.
Sure.
Some of those things that individuals might value, like parents, let's just call them stakeholders,
Sure.
And so it's interesting if that's what's being put forward as, what people want, as in from schools, then it begs the question, well, how could you measure it? Why would you measure it? So maybe we should take one step back and answer the question, why are we measuring things? Like, what's this obsession? Because it's not just America. It must be the Western world, and it's actually not the Western world now because it's entered other educational systems like China and Singapore. So what's this obsession? Absolute obsession, and I'm being very intentional with my language there, around measurement in education or educational systems. What is going on?
Yeah. I think it's a great question, and I think that there are two different ways of answering it. One is to say that parents and other stakeholders are not inside the building with young people, and that in many, if not most of the countries that pay for public education for young people, there is some form of democratic self-rule. Not in all places that have public education systems, but in most. And that as a result, people ought to be informed about how this public institution, right, the public school, is performing and what we're all getting in return for the major investment that we're making. And I think there's a lot of positive things that we can say about people being involved in a democratic process and co-governing a public institution together, right? I'm speaking to you right now in 2026 from the United States, a country that is losing its ability to function as a democracy. It is very important for people to be able to weigh evidence, to have discussions across difference, to be able to render judgment and make decisions, and to know that together they can govern institutions as large as the public education system here in the United States, where we've got 50 million kids and 98,000 schools. So that's one answer. But then another answer is, well, we want to measure everything and we want it to be quantifiable so that it can fit into a spreadsheet so that the neoliberal regime can ensure that there is return on investment for the resources that are being expended on education. And that if there isn't a return on an investment, then something is wrong and pressure needs to be applied corporate style in a manner that results in people at the bottom of the system, teachers, respond in whatever way the people at the top of the system, so this would be folks who run state education systems, or we have a Department of Education these days at the federal level in name alone, but in previous presidential regimes, we had a functioning federal Department of Education, so that they can exert authority and try to control schools from afar. Now, that's a much less inspiring vision, and I think that when we think about these two uses of information, it actually unshackles us from the attachment to the quantifiable, from the notion that the only kind of measurement that matters is whatever can be recorded in a league table. That's true for that second vision that I was talking about. That's true if somebody is trying to centrally make decisions about schools that he or she has never visited. But it's not true in the case of local stakeholders who are engaged in a process of self-governance and a meaningful kind of local accountability. Then we can say, well, what you see with your eyes is assessment too. What you hear with your ears, right? Are children laughing on the playground, right? That's assessment. I wrote a paper with a colleague named Derek Gottlieb where we originally titled it "In Praise of Squishy Measures," uh, and we were just trying to make the case that you can be in favor of assessment and measurement without being in favor of this neoliberal vision of governance via spreadsheet. I can't remember what we actually called it. It's in praise of some kind of measures, but it's a squishy measures, right? It's the journal. The journal didn't like it, but that's exactly what it is. It's okay that some of our evidence is a little bit squishy, that it comes through our human senses, that it wasn't produced by a machine that is laser reading multiple choice tests. That's okay. That counts. It's just that it wouldn't count for the kinds of governance from afar that modern, highly developed economies have tended towards in Europe, in Australia, in New Zealand, in the United States, in much of South America, and in many East Asian countries in the last couple decades.
Now, I'm going to have to push you a little bit on a couple of points. So one point in particular, and I should point out I'm extremely sympathetic. You mentioned the neoliberal agenda, the managerial language that you use. I know it was intentional. I know it's not your language, but that's the language that educational systems use. A perfect example is return on investment. Like that's management business speak. So I'm extremely sympathetic. Now, the issue I have is that I've now been having this conversation with colleagues on and on for 30 plus years about trying to push back neoliberal agendas, so on and so forth. But yet everything they try doesn't work. So I guess my question to you is, no matter what academics have tried, what committees have tried, what school councils have tried, boards have tried, so on and so forth, does it seem to budge or change the neoliberal agenda? So I guess my question to you, and I'm playing a little bit of devil's advocate here, is that isn't that just a utopian idea? Maybe should we just give up and just accept this is the current paradigm, we can't change it, and we should just get on and just accept what we have? Or if we're going to change it, how can we actually seriously change it in a meaningful way?
Yeah. A few different ways to answer that one. One is to talk about incremental change. So here in the United States, we had, I think, the worst form of accountability that appears in nations that have tended towards these kinds of test-based accountability systems. So there were automatic triggers for school closure, for teachers being fired, for schools being reconstituted as charter schools, which is one of the ways that schools get exposed to market forces here in the United States. The metrics used were based entirely on student standardized test scores, poverty and other kinds of headwinds that students face was not taken into account in determining goals for schools. Universal proficiency was the articulated aim. There was no capacity building included in this process. It was a badly designed system that you could argue was designed to fail, but was actually worse than that, was just designed by people who don't understand how schools work and who don't understand teachers and who don't really give a damn about the many things schools do other than fill kids up with whatever can be measured by a machine on the back end. And we don't have that anymore. Now, we still have to administer standardized tests in grades 3 through 8, as well as 1 year of high school. But there are no automatic triggers anymore. There are more metrics included in the accountability algorithm than just student standardized test scores. It's not a huge step forward, but it's a step forward. And many states have since then changed their state systems to make them even less awful in terms of their design and the execution of those systems. So we can see that activism, agitation from the public, that scholarship from academics that lends evidence to those who are on the ground, many times also academics standing side by side with other stakeholders, can lead to incremental change. Then I think, there's another view of this, which is, oftentimes people engage in resistance in informal ways, and that it's possible for teachers and principals and parents and community members to resist the accountability regime at the local level and to say, I know what it says in statute, I know what I am technically required to do, and I will do just enough to get along and not bring authorities down on us at our school, but that is not going to be my priority. And what I am going to prioritize is what's best for young people. And we've always seen educators doing this, right? There's a long history of teachers resisting reform. And some of that can be explained for reasons like, insufficient professional development or teachers not having enough time to understand how wonderful the new reform is. But some of it can just be described as good sense, right? Teachers saying, you know what? Actually, I know a thing or two. I've been doing this for a while. There are many of us who feel the way that I do. I'm not going along with this. I'll do just enough that you technically won't be able to find a reason to issue some sort of citation to me or dock my pay. But I'm not going along with this because I don't think it's right for the young people in my care. So I think that's a second thinking about this, is to say that, if we as academics can help people see the world a little bit more clearly such that they can use their own agency, their own good sense to resist what they think is wrong and to embrace what they think is right, then I think that matters too. And then the third way that I would answer this is, that the alternative to saying something, the alternative to doing what you can is saying nothing and doing nothing. And so even if it doesn't make a difference, I think for many of us, it's better than the alternative of just acquiescing and saying, I guess I'll go along with it. I know that I hold my head just a little bit higher, knowing that, my daughter has testified alongside me at the State House here in Massachusetts, and that she knows that her father did what he could, even if it didn't always result in change, and even if it never resulted in major change, that's a lesson that I think it's important for us to pass down to the next generation, because it isn't always the case that our actions don't result in change. We may be hitting a roadblock here, but we don't know how our activism and our engagement may have ripple effects elsewhere. And that there are plenty of cases we can point to of people coming together, of using evidence, whether from the ivory tower or not, to direct a kind of movement that has resulted in a change in their quality of life or in their ability to pursue their self-interest.
No. Now, thank you for answering that question. I'll tell you why, because I think what can happen is that you can get a little bit worn down. Like if you hit roadblock after roadblock, I think it's understandable in human nature to kind of throw your hands up in the air a little bit and say, look, I give in. I've tried my best, but my best is not good enough. And so I actually appreciate you answering that in a couple of different ways, talking about what's actually worked. And then, that was your first answer around the incremental, kind of change. That's really important. I think people have to hear that. Because I think educational systems can just really wear you down. I think, and organisations in general, I think, can just wear you down. So there's something very reaffirming about what you just responded to. So that question was out there for anyone who's a little bit kind of pessimistic and, dare I say it, cynical about organisational systems. Yeah, so thank you. All right, let's move on. Let's go to education wars. All right, so in your recent book, you explore culture wars threatening public education. That's a good leading question because you were talking about public education before. So from book bans to parent rights movements, So what's actually really driving this extremist assault on public schools, particularly obviously where you are in the US? And how is it different from past conflicts over education? So what's like really at stake here? What's going on?
Yeah. Yeah. Another great question. So, we have always fought over our schools here in the United States, and I would imagine that this is true anywhere where people have any measure of democratic control over their schools, right? That we don't always agree. We don't agree about how we want to live, or how we want to govern ourselves. And our schools are, in many ways, a vision of the future, right? That what we do to educate the young is a form of envisioning the future that we all want to live in. And so, of course, if we disagree at all in our society, we're going to disagree about what our schools should do and what our schools should look like. That part's not new, and there have been many culture war flare-ups in the United States over the years. Every generation has its case. Perhaps the most famous here in the United States was the infamous Scopes monkey trial, in which Clarence Darrow, the most well-remunerated lawyer of his time, engaged in a legal battle of wits and rhetoric against William Jennings Bryan, a two-time presidential candidate, over the teaching of evolution. And today, the fights are, not so different in that they are culture war, red meat territory. So, claims about teachers indoctrinating students, pushing so-called gender ideology, using quote unquote critical race theory to teach white children to hate themselves. A whole variety of stuff that could have come from daytime talk shows, but is instead coming out of the mouths of elected officials. And that's not especially new, although it can be especially horrifying these days. What is new is that the aim in mind is a bit different this time. So whereas previous culture wars have really been about trying to enact a particular vision of what public education should look like, the current war in education here in the United States that's unfolding around these cultural conflicts is about whether there will be public education at all. So the culture war in many ways is being used as a way of alienating people from their public schools, as a way of dividing their sympathies. So in previous culture wars here in the United States, there was no question about whether or not there would be public schools. The only question was what would be taught, right? Who would be eligible to teach? What would be tested? How involved would parents be? How old would students be when they left the school system? Now the question is, will there be public schools? Will we continue to have democratically controlled schools? Will we continue to fully fund education? Will we offer it to every young person in this country? I'm less well-versed on the history of Australia's schools, but my sense is that the broad contours are relatively the same in that the further back you go, the less just, the less adequate, the less well-resourced, and the less impressive the schools get, right? They're still full of problems. Everybody can go to a school and find, 101 things they would change, and yet they're better today than they were yesterday. They're better this year than last year. They're better this century than they were last century. And here in the United States, we are being sold a vision of failure, right? The schools have failed. They have derailed. This experiment is over. What we need to do is embrace the free market. Everybody should be given a debit card in the mail This is something they actually do in the state of Arizona here in the United States. They call it the education debit card. You get an amount preloaded on it, and it's actually untraceable because the ideologues in Arizona who created this are more concerned with pulling those dollars out of the public education system than they are with how you use those dollars. So what they want is to destabilize the public education system in Arizona such that it becomes impossible to continue to run public schools there. And the best way to do that is to pull $10,000 out at a time, stick it on a debit card, and mail it to families that have been talked in to this being a good idea. Now, if they spend it on iPads or trips to Disneyland or abcmouse.com or whatever else they decide to spend it on, these ideologues are agnostic about it because their aim is ideological, not pragmatic, right? Their aim is about their free market orthodoxy, not about young people learning something. And so that's the position we find ourselves in the U.S. right now, is the culture war being used to try to convince people that public education is unsalvageable and that a market solution is the only answer.
Wow. So the logical question that I have to respond to, that's a follow-up on that, is then if public education system is so problematic and they're saying, okay, then what is the shift to the alternative? So the alternative is what? So you gave an example of Arizona. So do they mean like what you call charter schools, which are like independently funded schools, like what we would call private schools, like, private schools, independent schools, we would call that in Australia, and like, they're self-funded through tuition fees. So is that the push towards public to private? Is that what you're essentially saying?
Well, so that would be one option.
Oh, so, one option, right, on the table.
Part of the messaging is that people should have more options. Of course, having more options doesn't mean you have any rights, right? So currently in the United States, you have plenty of rights. If your child is disabled, for instance, your child has a right to a free and appropriate education in the least restrictive possible environment. In a private school, you don't have any rights if your child is disabled. You can go look around in the free market and see if whatever you've been given in the form of this voucher will cover the cost of educating your child. So there's a lot of rhetoric about private schools, about homeschooling, about the power of technology. There are so-called micro schools that have popped up. There's a lot of free market banditry and a lot of potential for fleecing people and doing wrong by children in the service of making a buck in what is increasingly becoming a Wild West, at least in states with Republican majorities in their state legislature. In nearly every one of those, and so we've got several dozen cases like that, they've enacted private school voucher bills, which enable families to take money out of the state treasury and then use that to send their kids to private school. In most cases, this would be a religious school. Now, there are countries that have traditions of using public dollars to send their children to private schools. Here in the United States, we don't have that tradition. And it's a dangerous one because the way that it's unfolding right now threatens to topple the public education system. I think we could have a different conversation about designing a system in which public schools and private schools coexist together. That is not the vision here. The vision is of destroying the public education system and replacing it with an entirely privatized system. And a part of that belief is motivated by a desire to minimize investments in education, right? So here in the United States, because the vast majority of students attend public schools, the vast majority of students have rights, and spending on public education has gone up year over year for as long as we've had public schools. And those dollars have increasingly been spent on students who previously were either excluded or under-resourced. And so there has been this tremendous progress made in terms of equity in education in this country. And that's one of the problems as the opponents of public schools see it, is that we're spending too much on the wrong kinds of kids, that we ought to be minimizing what we're spending on them and let them seek their own interests if they want to spend their own dollars on it. And then related to that is the push for an evangelical Christian society. So Christian nationalism has come roaring back here in the United States, and a big part of the push to get kids out of public schools is linked to a desire to get them into private religious schools. So you've got a bit of a strange set of bedfellows here, where you've got religiously orthodox people, market-oriented ideologues, anti-union types, all united together around this vision of toppling the public education system.
You see, that's very interesting, because that's a very useful response. Thank you to answer my question, because I think inevitably what will happen is that you'll end up with a mix, won't you? And it will inevitably dilute the public education system. So if that was the intent, it's hard not to see how it wouldn't work. You know what I mean? Like, so whether it's a state-based intention or across the board, across the United States, I'm sure it's all of the above. Because if I go back to here in Australia, that you find that as a proportion, public versus private, it's almost equal now. Whereas if you go back 10 and then 20 and 30, it was, like public, kind of 80-20. And then over time, it's gone 70-30, 60-40. So you see over time how that proportion changes. And inevitably, that's what will happen, because there's a perception that private education systems are far superior than public education systems. Because, look, they've got that new gym, and they've got, nice uniforms. And these are not meaningful measures of, if you want to measure it. Again, I don't intentionally mean to use the word measure, but like as a parent.
No, but you should use that word, right? Because the absence of decent measures of school quality is one of the things that schools that operate in a free market environment take advantage of. So they can't show you that their kids are learning anymore. They can't show you that their kids are becoming better citizens or learning how to get along across difference any better, or that they're more artistic or creative. But they can show you that their kids wear uniforms, that they've got a new computer lab, that they've got a new rugby pitch, and they know that you will read those signals as being indicative of the quality of the school. And this is, I don't want to malign private schools, but people do need to be aware of the fact that if you don't know what the experience a child is having inside a school is, you're actually placing your child at some degree of risk. This doesn't mean that you're making a dangerous and irresponsible decision by enrolling your child in a private school. It just means that you can't take marketing as a source of evidence, and that actually we don't know, you won't know about the quality of a school until your child has been there for a year or two. It's not like buying a sandwich where you take a bite and you know whether or not you like it.
Or buying a car. Well, actually, in a way, I was replicating that marketing strategies that these schools use, because they do exactly what I just said is exactly what they use for marketing, as in, our cricket footy teams finished, first in the country. This is the new gym, you are right. These are marketing ploys purely for the purposes of, bums on seats, just use an obvious expression. And so you are right. They buy into this rhetoric, and it is that marketing, kind of rhetoric, and it is. And I actually thank you for, kind of highlighting those kind of what's going on here, because that's exactly what these schools do, because at the end of the day, they need enrollments in order to survive. And then I found that you have this pooling effect, these mega schools. So, success again, this is a big debate around what success means, of course, but success means more success. And then you have this kind of tradition. Oh, we have this tradition. We've been going for 50 plus years, and we have all these Rhodes Scholars and prime ministers. And so you can see how this marketing machine just generates this kind of, I'm going to call it, what's the word I want to look for? What's the word? I can't think of the word. Propaganda. That's you build this propaganda machine, and then you start believing it, right? Well, it must be true. Sorry, I got on a bit of a tangent there, but let's go to questions of reform. So this is an important question, and I'm actually very interested in how you answer this. So now you've studied, education reform, and it consistently fails to achieve its stated goals. Now, is there something fundamentally flawed in how we conceptualize educational change, or are these failures actually serving someone's interests? So what does actually successful reform actually look like? It's a bit of a two-parter, same kind of thing, but you know what? Educational reform just always seems to fail.
Yeah.
Why?
Yeah. Well, a big part of the problem is the divide between how quickly self-styled reformers need their reforms to work. This is often timed with electoral cycles, and how long it takes to actually change an organization. So, if you're elected governor of the state of Massachusetts, you've got 4 years to prove to voters that you are the transportation governor, or you are the healthcare governor, or you are the education governor. And so if you want to be the education governor, then you're going to introduce educational reforms that you believe are going to transform schools, hopefully in 3 years, because you'll be running for re-election in that 4th year. And that simply isn't how schools work. We know that schools change when cultures change. We know that when cultures change and systems change alongside those cultures, and when those systems and those cultures are in place long enough that they become a part of what we do in a school, that's when you see an organization move from operating one way to operating another way. Can you do it in 4 years? Maybe, with a lot of investment, with a lot of time and attention. And that's the second problem with reform, is that it usually is under-resourced and overscaled. So nobody ever says, I'm going to be the education reformer president, or I'm going to be the education reformer governor, or even I'm going to be the education reformer mayor, and I'm really going to work with this one school or this small consortium of schools, right? It's always across the entire school district, or across the entire state, or across the entire nation. So working at that scale is going to require a tremendous investment of resources. Here in the United States, we have 98,000 public schools. We have 13,000 school districts. So school districts generally align with town or city boundaries. And we've got 50 million students. We've got 3.5 million teachers. And we have 50 different curriculums because each state has a set of powers that the federal government does not actually have over what gets carried out inside the schools. And so if you're trying to operate at this kind of scale, right, it's going to require a tremendous investment of resources just to get additional personnel into the schools to work with educators, to free them up so that they can watch each other teach, or so that they can learn the new curriculum, or to pay them so that they can spend the summer. Summer is when we have school vacation here in the United States. So June, July, and August usually, which is a colder time of year, I know, for you all. And it's going to take time for teachers to change their practice. So, what does reform look like when it works? What reform looks like when it works is something that is inherently resistant to the kind of large-scale, low-investment interventions that we tend to see, being initiated by people whose interests are primarily in appearing to do something, right? That they won't necessarily be held accountable for whatever failed to happen, 8 years from now, as long as they manage to be reelected or reappointed or, whatever it is that they're seeking in terms of, their own self-interest, or enacting what they think is, the best interests of others and just being deeply misguided about how schools change. So, what does it look like? It looks like teachers suddenly having more time so that they aren't fully consumed by preparing tomorrow's lessons, delivering those lessons, grading student work, and then doing the whole thing over again the next day. So it means that we're going to have fewer hours of contact with students for these teachers so that they can meet together and talk and plan. And of course, they aren't going to just miraculously change on their own. They need direction. So it's going to involve people coming in and having some expertise that they can share with educators, and so that they can also learn from educators at the school site something about what those teachers know, because those teachers know a lot, right? They are experts in what's happening in their own local context. And so that's a give and take, just like good teaching always is. You're not going to be able to develop an app and put it on every teacher's phone and say, okay, we're going to give you the afternoon to learn this. It's going to take time. It's probably going to take an entire year or 2 years for educators to work through this. On top of that, what else do you need, right? You're going to need to do things like change the school schedule, probably, if you want teachers to be changing their practice. You'll need to change the curriculum. We can begin to walk through all of the things that need to happen, and it becomes impossible to imagine issuing some kind of centralized directive that is going to lead to this kind of transformation, at least in a system this large. If you lived in a tiny country where you had, 200 schools, maybe you've got a set of leaders who are just so fabulous and incredible that they can one by one go school to school and work with people and teach them whatever fantastic, amazing techniques they happen to know how to deliver inside schools. But anywhere else, it's going to involve building good systems that enable people to work together, to learn from each other, to continue to develop their practice over time. And so I would say that, the key ingredient that usually is absent in educational reform is time. Time during the day to begin to change and grow, and time over the span of years to assess whether or not it worked. It's not going to work in 1 year, even if you have plenty of time during the day to begin to move towards whatever change you want to enact. Maybe 2 years. 3 years is more likely. 4 years is probably reasonable. But if you want to enact a major change, I would say, let's see what it looks like 5 years from now. And that simply isn't how most educational reform looks. It tends to look more like show me results by the end of the year, or there are going to be consequences.
Yeah, I like asking. I think that's an important question. I wanted to ask it too, because there's an element in educational systems, and I just think of my time as a secondary school teacher, high school teacher, secondary school teacher, and even now in higher ed, where you get reform fatigue. It's just one thing after another, to the point where you just lose track of the change or the reform. And it either peters out, and either forget about it and move on, or well, that didn't work. We tried our best, Jack, but that didn't work. So it's a mixture of all of that, and very rarely does it, actually happen in the way that it's envisaged. Right? The stated aim, whatever that is.
Well, and that of course, right? When it breeds this resentment among teachers. Where even if it was a good idea, they've had so many bad experiences where they've been burned over and over. Spend all of this time trying to learn this new system. Well, we don't do that anymore. Now spend all of this time doing this thing. That even if you had a really well-designed reform, you would still need to account for the reasonable skepticism that educators would have based on their experience.
Exactly. And it's interesting because I have always argued that it breeds burnout, which is quite a significant, not only psychological and soon to be psychiatric phenomenon. And it's an area that I have a fair bit of knowledge about and personal experience with. But then in my season 1 of the podcast, I've interviewed a few psychiatrists who are leading experts on burnout. And I'm doing a research project on teacher burnout. So I feel like I've got a reasonable amount of authority about the topic. And it's interesting that it inevitably leads to burnout, like teacher burnout is one of the drivers.
Yeah.
And a research project that I'm working on at the moment will, I have no doubts, will probably kind of reinforce or, if you like, confirm what we hypothesized. Now, I just want to, you mentioned time. I agree. That's one of the comments that teachers mention. Oh, I wish I had more time for X, Y, and Z. If the crunch point is teacher time, as in not having enough, so you mentioned time's important, and I agree. How do we build more time if we are going to action a reform? So like, I know that's a very abstract kind of question, and inevitably it turns to workload, like teacher workload kind of stuff. But then how do you convince a decision maker that time is more important as opposed to less time? Or I don't know. I'm just like, I just wanted to ask you a little bit more about, because you did emphasize time, and I agree time's really important, as well as, collegial teamwork and mentoring / coaching and so on and so forth. But sorry, I'll let you answer that.
Question about time. Yeah. So it's a great question about time and where it would come from and how you would convince anybody that it's as important as it is. Picking up from that last part about convincing people of its importance, I think that the first step is convincing people that teachers are professionals, that they aren't just, bottom of the line implementers. They're not people working an assembly line who just need to enact whatever the corporate higher ups have told them to. That they have real expertise, that developing that expertise over time is a fundamental part of the job, and that it takes time, that changing practice takes time, that they need to stay fresh in terms of their own professional skill sets, just the way that lawyers and doctors do, that their work is multidimensional and involves far more than whatever is visible to students in the classroom, right? One of the classic problems with teacher professionalism is the apprenticeship of observation, as Dan Lordy called it. So, we all think we know what it takes to be a teacher because we've spent so many hours watching teachers teach. But we never are behind the scenes with them, watching them develop lesson plans or, practice pedagogical technique or give feedback to colleagues or mark student papers. We're never there for all of that work. So, I think a part of the time issue is helping people understand just how multifaceted and demanding this professional work is. And then, how do we get that time? Because, there are very real constraints on budgets. Budgets are real things. And here in the United States, and I would imagine that it's similar in Australia, roughly 80% of the budget goes to personnel expenses. So it isn't as if we can simply say, oh, well, we'll just reallocate the budget from, the well-appointed library, which is, 30% of our school's budget, we'll buy, 50% fewer books, and we'll hire a few more teachers. No, the library is also under-resourced. The cafeteria is also under-resourced. Schools are very lean operations. So without infusing new funds into the system, how do you find more time for teachers to do all the elements of their jobs that go beyond just student contact hours? I think it requires thinking creatively. So what can we do with teachers' aides or paraprofessionals or ESPs, as they are increasingly referred to here in the United States, education support professionals? What can be done in terms of temporarily combining classrooms for particular kinds of work, such that one teacher might have one larger class one time per day, knowing that students would do particular kinds of work in that larger class and other kinds of work in a normal size class, or maybe even in two smaller classes, maybe with the assistance of additional teachers' aides. What would it look like to be thoughtful about AI, and instead of saying, as many here in the United States are saying, AI is going to replace teachers? It won't, because so much of teaching is about relationship building, is about establishing trust with students, about motivating them, keeping them focused on their work and not just giving up, on being a role model for them. Right. So AI isn't going to replace teachers there, but maybe it could do some of the drudgery that teachers have to do. And so maybe they continue to spend just as many hours of the day in student contact hours, but spend fewer hours filling out paperwork. Maybe there are uses of AI that end up being valuable in terms of lesson design or in terms of feedback on student work. I don't think it's ready to just be outsourced to AI now, but I think these are important questions to ask. The basic question to ask about AI is, how do we keep the good and get rid of the bad, right? How do we spend more time doing the things that are valuable and rewarding, and how do we spend less time doing the stuff we don't want to do? And the danger, of course, is that we get that exactly wrong, is that we'll replace all of the stuff that we enjoy and that is valuable, things like building relationships with our students. We'll replace that, and we'll instead be stuck with the parts of our work that we don't like, writing out, disciplinary forms, or engaging in compliance exercises.
Yeah, it's interesting.
Go ahead.
Yeah, so I was going to say that what I hear you talking about is that the abstract concept of time in practice can come in different forms, and that's what I hear you saying. And I find it interesting because that's the difficulty of this argument, because it's not a workload argument of, I need more free periods per week or per day, which inevitably it becomes a debate around. And I find it interesting here, at least in Australia, and maybe you can comment on this if it's the same in America, is that the teacher unions are arguing for more pay for teachers, understandably so. That's one of their jobs. However, as a consequence of that, as soon as you get more pay, productivity has to increase. So, of course, the idea that you get more time, that's a luxury, you see. So here I feel like they've done a disservice to teachers in the teaching profession, because as soon as you ask for more pay, inevitably your employer will be saying, well, what's the productivity dividend? That's the argument used. So you need to do more, Jack and Steve,
right.
Not less. So here you are arguing more time, but yet you want more pay, Steve and Jack, but yet you're asking for more time. Isn't that a bit cheeky, Jack? Kind of thing. You know what I mean? You want more pay, but yet you want less teacher contact time and less work. Come on, Jack. You see how the argument is can be a bit problematic there. I mean, what are your thoughts to that? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, absolutely. Right. It requires, I think, again, incremental change over time, that if people don't understand what teacher work really entails. If they continue to view teaching as important but easy, you aren't going to convince them that you need both more pay and more time to do the elements of the work that they don't even understand need to be done. And so, I think it's important that teachers can earn a decent living, that they can live with dignity on their salaries. But it's also important that they are willing to do the work and that future generations will be willing to do the work. You mentioned burnout a little earlier, and we know that here in the United States, at least, that teaching is becoming increasingly unattractive to young people, that especially as the cost of higher education rises, they're saying, listen, I'm going to graduate with debt, and teaching already is a profession that is going to pay me less than I would make in other professions that require a university degree, right? Why am I going to do it if it's going to be stressful, if it's going to require me working nights and weekends, if it's going to require me being immediately thrown into the deep end professionally, right? There's no induction really here in the United States where you start off with a kind of reduced workload, and after a few years, you take on a full teacher workload. No, day one, you're a teacher, and on retirement day, you're a teacher. And so given these conditions, I think it's really important that we begin to have thoughtful conversations about what a sustainable teaching profession looks like. And I think you're right, that teachers do need to be a little bit more vocal about the rewards that they can get from their work that are not just monetary in nature. Because I think, union leaders are always trying to do best by their members. But I think, members haven't always had the issue of time made salient for them, right? I think it's so often just assumed to be a part of the job. It's assumed that teachers will be making personal sacrifices. It's assumed that your day will be a blitzkrieg from, the time you arrive on campus in the morning until the moment you leave. And in fact, later than that, because you'll be grading papers late into the evening. That's accepted. And so I think that we need to not accept that. We need to envision a sustainable profession, start talking about what it would require for it to be a sustainable profession, and then start advocating for those conditions, which are just as important as pay.
Assumed that you will suffer, and dare I say it, a badge of honor, that you suffer. Yep. And that's the rhetoric that I have a problem with.
Yep. Right.
That somehow it's a badge of honor that you do all these things over and above, and that your suffering is somehow part of the gig. And it really bothers me as someone who's a former classroom teacher and a teacher now, that somehow that rhetoric is, I'm going to just call it for what it is, celebrated. Why are we celebrating burnout, right? Stuff like that. It really bothers me. Now, Jack, I want to change gears because I'm just conscious of the time and we've been going for a while. Let's change gears. So let's go to one of what I call one of my favorite books that you've written. That's From the Ivory Tower to the Schoolhouse. In fact, that's how I came across your work. I actually really
we talked about that on your podcast.
I know, and I think it's one of your best pieces of work, and I think it was one of your earliest pieces of work too, I think. Yep. Now, for those of you who are not across that, I think this question will just get us into the book a little bit. And I like it a lot because I want to ask this question, and then as you answer it, you'll be able to unpack the work a little bit more. Now, I should point out that any of your work that we refer to, I'll put in the episode descriptor for anyone who's listening. So the question I have is, why do so many promising ideas generated, like in educational research, fail to penetrate the world of classroom practice?
Yeah, we've talked a little bit about some of those factors in other questions. So listeners won't be surprised to hear me talk about things like the absence of time, or unrealistic expectations that are being placed on educators. But I think there are a few specific things that are unique to the failed relationship between the world of educational research and the world of educational practice. So one is that the spheres are really separate from each other in some deeply problematic and fixable ways. So in the world of educational research, when we publish our work, it's often in peer-reviewed, paywalled journals, which have a very particular kind of style, and which, even if people had access to, would often find impenetrable. That academics are taught in their doctoral studies to write for other academics, and they are not taught to write for the public. And in fact, they're often in the early stages of their careers discouraged from writing for the public, told to keep their heads down, earn tenure, at least here in the United States, and then maybe develop some opinions after that. So, the writing piece and the writing for particular audiences in particular kinds of places is a big part of the challenge. And the way that practitioners encounter work then often is through intermediaries or brokers. So Howard Gardner, for instance, who is one of the most celebrated academics by practitioners here in the United States, did not ever develop lesson plans for his theory of multiple intelligences, but lots of other people did. So, somebody named Thomas Armstrong wrote multiple books about how you could apply multiple intelligences in the classroom. Howard Gardner didn't get into K-12 schools here in the United States by going around and making stump speeches and handing out free lesson plans. In many ways, he got lucky because he had people who were translating his work for him. And that kind of translation service isn't available to most people. In fact, most people aren't even really thinking about how to get their work onto the radars of practitioners. And so you have this challenge of what I call in the book perceived significance, right? So if you're a practitioner and you're looking around, you say, I'm a math teacher. What's the new math research? Or I'm a special education teacher. What new research is coming out? It's not always clear where to look. And even if you knew where to look, it wouldn't always be clear how to get it or even how to read it. And so one of the ways that we can get around this challenge as academics is to begin to thoughtfully write for multiple kinds of audiences and to begin to directly engage practitioners, writing for them, talking with them, appearing on their podcasts, blogging, being on social media and responding to them. I think is one way to address that issue. Another challenge, which we've also talked about, is the fact that reform is hard and most teachers don't have time to change their practices. And so, let's say you're a researcher and you've got a great idea about how, Australian history can be taught in new ways. You've got all kinds of cool curricular materials. Problem is that teachers would need time to figure out how to incorporate those materials into their practice and to figure out how to deliver new kinds of lessons with new kinds of pedagogical techniques. And so, here's a place where, there are a variety of solutions, but they all take some kind of investment. So one is the idea of a research practice partnership. So universities and school districts or consortia of schools working together to try to develop a more robust connection in which researchers would be a little bit more aware of the constraints facing educators, and that might focus their research in particular ways. And then educators would have a more direct pipeline to the kind of research that's being done, and in fact, might welcome those researchers into their classrooms such that they don't just read about how their practices might change, they would actually get direct support in terms of transforming their practice. So there are some ways to address that, but they have to be thoughtfully designed. Those bridges don't presently exist. They need to be created. I would say one more problem is the fact that research often isn't designed in a way that makes it easy to travel, right? So in the world of educational research, we're often writing about something very specific. We're building on the work of many others. And so we tend not to be aggregating lots of research. We tend to see far fewer literature reviews, for instance, or systematic reviews. We tend to see fewer pieces that try to make sense of the field or to try to draw recent research together. And that's something that we could begin to value in higher education. We could say, listen, particularly in education, we are an applied field, right? We are not doing theoretical physics here. We're actually trying to shape practice out in the real world in a very particular sphere, whether it's K through 12 education or higher education. We're a practical field. And if you embrace that, you could say, maybe it does have just as much merit to publish a kind of summary of all the research that has been done on a particular subject in the past 10 years or 20. And maybe that could have as much value as publishing, a new single-authored study on, a particular kind of intervention that you developed and piloted and assessed. So, we could go much further into this, but I think the general theme is that we have two different spheres that are operating without each other in mind, and that it is possible to begin to think more about each other and to connect more with each other, and that it requires real intention, and that there's absolutely possibility there. I mentioned research practice partnerships as one possibility. There are all sorts of low-touch ways to do it. Well, so I think the conversation started in Australia, actually. So the conversation is an online resource that recruits academics to write op-ed style pieces for the public. And then they make those freely available online or to newspapers that want to pick them up, right? There's a way to just begin luring academics into the realm of public scholarship. But then, all of us in higher education could do a better job of being more connected with schools, more connected with real teachers. And I would say, we often suffer from the same problem that reformers suffer from in terms of thinking about the largest possible scale. Well, it wouldn't be worth it to work just with one school, right? I want to transform an entire system. But my God, so many of us are former classroom teachers. We would have been thrilled beyond our wildest imaginations if, while we were teachers, we could have transformed our entire schools in some way. I know I would have been. I know that, just changing my own classroom often felt like a tremendous win. Doing anything at, the entire grade level, just across the social studies, often felt like a huge win. And so, being willing to see it as worth our time and incredibly valuable to do something just with one school or one small group of schools, knowing that, that too could be written about and could be shared, but that it's okay to say, that my impact is primarily visible in this one place, because that one place might serve 500 students every single year.
No, I agree that the two spheres, I like a Venn diagram, my maths background, the academy and schools, that they don't even overlap or touch each other, so they're so disconnected. Yeah. And it's interesting for you to talk about the relationship from the academy to the classroom, but what about the other way around? Because in your book, you have a very interesting chapter on direct instruction, because I mention direct instruction because it's made a comeback in Australia. In Australia, we use the term explicit teaching. I don't know why they do this, right? But that's the term they use for direct instruction, right? which comes out of the US. And you have a very interesting chapter on this. Why is it that academics are so against direct instruction in general? You do go into detail in this book, but it's almost the relationship from the classroom to the academy. And so you've talked about the academy to the school, or the classroom. Maybe if you could talk a little bit about direct instruction here.
Sure. Yeah. Direct instruction, designed by Zig Engelman, and if you go to his website, he has published, it's got to be into the hundreds at this point, hundreds of studies where he has shown direct instruction works at raising student test scores. That if you want students to improve in a particular area, that you can design a direct instruction program that will get them there. And why do teachers hate it? Teachers hate it because it often just looks like a scripted curriculum. Zig Engelman himself drew the analogy to actors and playwrights and said, actors, their job is just to enact the play. They don't also write it, right? Why would teachers also be the people who are developing lesson plans? And what that shows is that Zig Engelman, smart as he is, and I don't know if he's still with us, but he was funny and charismatic, but also fundamentally did not understand teachers, did not understand the way that teachers think of themselves as professionals who do understand how to build curricular resources, who do know how to design lessons, and who want to customize those lessons for the students who are in front of them. And so, as researchers, we need to understand who teachers are and who students are and what classrooms are like. Even those of us who have been classroom teachers, we stay out long enough and we can forget what the real world is like. The real world is complicated and it's messy and it's full of human beings who are complicated themselves. And so, you're right to point to, it isn't merely that educational research can, fail to make it into the schools. It can make it into the schools, and then teachers can boot it right back out. So, what do you do about that? I think again, the answer is, we really ought to be talking to each other a little bit more. We really ought to be convening and hearing from each other. What are you working on? What is important to you? What do you value?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. All right. Now, I'm just conscious of the time. We've been going for a while, and we're on the home stretch. I've got 3 questions left. So I want to change tact here and go, your background is in history. And so I want to ask you a question about the role of history and what lessons from the past have we stubbornly refused to learn? So you have a background in history. So what can we learn from history? What are we failing to learn from history, and why should we care about history here?
Yeah. Well, I'll try to keep my responses a little briefer than my earlier ones, so that listeners can move on with their lives. What do we refuse to learn from history and education? I think what we refuse to learn is that change is slow. Right, is something we've talked about already. Change is slow, and it often can be invisible on a day-to-day basis, in the same way that watching your children grow up can be invisible from day to day. And then you look at a picture from last year or from 5 years ago, and you think, how did all the time go by so quickly? And if we begin to take that long view, I think that we become a little bit more patient with school transformation, with school improvement. I think that patience makes us a little bit more right about what we decide to do. I think that it tempers our expectations about the timelines that things will be achieved in, which then leads to, I think, other kinds of positive results, like turning down the heat on teachers, turning down the heat on our rhetoric about school performance and what schools should be doing. I think that's one lesson. And another, which is very related, and which we've also discussed already, is that schools keep getting better over time, not worse, despite the fact that our rhetoric gets more and more negative every year, at least here in the United States, although I've also read plenty of Australian headlines about schools. Despite that fact, schools continue to get better. And so is it possible to learn that from history and to say, yes, we do want schools to get better. Yes, we are going to press as hard as we can for change that will work and that will make a difference in the lives of young people. And we're going to do that knowing that our schools are better than they used to be, and that we are on a positive trajectory, and that no, the sky is not in fact falling. And that if we are willing to put in the work, we can continue to improve them. But I think that's a really important lesson, because that will do a number of things, including keep out highly disruptive reform that is designed to turn around failing schools that aren't in fact failing in most cases. And if we can get rid of that disruption, then I think that allows us to make more actual change in terms of what's happening in schools on a daily basis.
No, thank you for those insights. As a historian, if you like, by training, and I had to ask you that question because inevitably, I have no doubts you would get a question, or you would get an attitudinal type question around, well, what history? What useful, or what use can history have for kind of education, or as a discipline or field? And so thank you for answering that, because I wanted you to first of all defend history, of course, which as a student of history myself, I think it's very important. But I wanted to hear your insights on that, because you're in an excellent position to be able to kind of answer that in a very unique way, I think. So, all right, second last question, Jack. Name 3 books. They can be any books you like. You can plug some of your work that either influence some of your thinking or that you would recommend to listeners.
Sure. Well, I can't resist the temptation to name a book of mine. You've named a couple, so you named you've named 3, I think. So from the Ivory Tower to the Schoolhouse was my second book, and Beyond Test Scores was, I think, my third, and The Education Wars was number 6, maybe. So let's squeeze in another one in there that may be interesting for Australian listeners, and it's called Off the Mark: How Grades, Ratings, and Rankings Undermine Learning but Don't Have to. I think that academics and practitioners, and in fact, parents, will be interested in that, because it touches on a lot of the themes that we've been discussing today, and really dives into the tension between the fundamental aim of school, which is learning, and all of the other things that we end up spending time and energy and our worries on, and namely the credentialing process, the obsession with compiling the right set of badges and tokens that can be cashed in at some later date for rewards, and the commodification of education. So I think we've talked a little bit less about that, and that may be something that listeners will have an interest in. I'll make a fiction recommendation. I started the show sharing that I've been doing lots of rehab on my recently repaired shoulder labrum, and I've been listening to a lot of audiobooks, and the best was by Louise Erdrich. It's her latest book called The Mighty Red, and I enjoyed it so much that every time I am hooking my arm up to a pulley and hoisting it up and listening to some other book, I fondly recall listening to The Mighty Red and keep thinking, maybe I'll just listen to that one over again. So that would be the second one. And the book I'm reading right now, before bed, nonfiction tends to be before bed, because even if it's interesting, it can be just dry enough to knock me out. But I'm reading a great one right now, and it's called Dinner with King Tut, and it's about experimental archaeology. So-called rogue archaeologists who are doing things to try to understand former worlds. So they're not just, digging up clay pots and bones. They're also doing things like, going on day-long gazelle hunts with, stone spears and recreating meals that people of the past would have had just to see if that's actually how they lived and, what it would have been like.
Excellent. I like it. I like it when people, I think it's important you plug your own work. So thank you for doing that. And it gives you permission to do so. But I like it when people suggest books outside of their field, because I think that's very fascinating. Some of the rationale reasons behind, why they do so. But anyway, and thanks for the explanation for those as well. Now, my last question, and I ask all my guests this.
Yeah.
Is there anything you think we've missed, or is there anything you would like to kind of add before we finish?
Oh, is there anything I missed? Well, I think we missed the part where you say, I've spoken to all of these people in Australia who really want you to come visit again. And we've organized a fund, and we used it. We got you a ticket. So, the question, Jack, is what is the best set of dates for you to come down to Australia and spend a couple weeks with us? So that's the question that I wish had been asked. And we'll have to discuss that next time I'm on the show with you.
Excellent. I do like that idea. Be careful what you wish for too, because that might come to fruition. So knowing how popular you are, there's no reason why that actually could not happen. But I don't know. Look, Jack, we might leave it there because I think we're running out of time. But look, I've really enjoyed this. I've been wanting to get you on my podcast for a while now. So I want to take this opportunity to thank you for your time, Jack Schneider. I appreciate it. And for those who are listening, I will make sure I place all those kind of Jack's work on the episode descriptor, plus a link to your profile and your projects at the University of Massachusetts. Any other thing, you think I should add, please do let me know. But Jack, thanks for your time.
Thank you for having me. This was great. It was just as much fun this time as it was last time.